Welcome to the Ignited Recovery Podcast, a new way forward for anyone looking for answers but feeling left out. If you've been searching for empowerment, triumph, and purpose, you've found them right here. You won't hear the same solutions, and you're not going to have any excuses to fall back on, because Ignited Recovery allows heroes to rise and become their best selves. I'm Dr. Adi Jaffe, and I can't wait to be your guide on this journey. Are you ready to become an ignited hero? We've all been hearing about the microbiome and how important it is for our health. It's kind of funny, right? Only 10 years ago, we believed that killing the bacteria on everything was the way to go. I mean, do you remember those sanitizer sprays everywhere? And now we're gradually learning that, surprise, surprise, not really, we actually need the bacteria around us to thrive and even survive. The thing is that everybody's been focusing almost exclusively on the bacteria in your body that helps you digest food. And that is really important because if you can't digest it, you can't live off of the nutrients, and then you develop all sort of GI problems and you have to... Never mind. But research has been showing us an incredible connection between bacteria in your gut and your mental health. Seriously. For instance, studies have shown that the bacteria in the gut of an animal can change its level of depression. And more research is coming out showing that the same exact thing probably plays a role in anxiety, depression, maybe even autism and ADHD. Isn't that amazing? So I did some research and I decided to add a probiotic mix that helps not only mood, but also the communication between my gut and the brain. It's called Amare, and their wellness kit takes care of everything that I need. The probiotics that have been researched to provide actual tangible help, and the prebiotics and everything that those bacteria need to thrive and do their work. I've been using it myself for 3 months, and I gotta say, it's really helped regulate my mood and keep me even. And it's helping me feel less foggy too, especially in the morning. Look, these guys really did their research, and this stuff is top notch. If you want to get it for yourself, just follow the link in our show notes and you can join the mind biome revolution with me. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Ignited Recovery Secrets podcast. I'm Adi Jaffe, Dr. Jaffe, and I'm so happy to be here with you today. We are in the middle of a whirlwind of producing and creating content that I hope is helpful for you. We are smack dab in the middle of the 21-day habit reset challenge I've talked about. If you're in it, I'm hoping you're loving it. And if you're not, you're going to want to join next time we have one. But I wanted to share with you here a little online conversation I'd been having on a Facebook Live that I have every week, where I talked about some of the ways that I see the current addiction treatment system failing a lot of the people that it purports to try to help. This is not always the easy conversation to have. It's not always the popular conversation to have. But look, I think we're failing people left and right. We're failing them over and over and over. And it's obvious in the sense that our overdose rates keep going up. And I give some of the reasons people give me for that and some of my rebuttals. I hope you will find it helpful and useful. As usual, let me know what works and what doesn't for you, what feels like it resonated. Either tag and kind of screenshot this and leave it on Instagram for me. That's one of the places where I look at a lot. Or just DM me or write us an email at info@ignited.com. Remember, I love it when you guys tell us topics you want to have, but this one really came up at the Facebook Live. Somebody wanted to talk about the treatment system and why it's not working, so we ended up having this conversation. I hope it was useful for you. Enjoy your Friday and your weekend. We will see you next week. All right, so somebody was discussing this with me just today. When I say discussing, I mean they were commenting on articles of mine in different places about recovery and whether the system is really failing people or not. And again, I've got my view on it. We will talk about it here in depth. But I'll tell you honestly, I only need one indicator that the system is failing us, and that is the constantly increasing, certainly never decreasing rate of overdose deaths. And overdose deaths are one piece of the puzzle. You add to that shortening of life through loss of health outside of just acute deaths, but you add all the other accidental deaths from drugs and alcohol. And there are a lot of them. They're in hundreds of thousands every year. And here's one of the first responses that I got. Somebody was like, well, it's fentanyl is what's doing it. And I'm not going to say I hate it. I think it's sad that we focus so much on the substances themselves. And the reason is, you know what? Fentanyl was not killing anybody in large numbers in the US 20 years ago. And we had pretty much the same exact addiction problem in the US 20 years ago. But people always like to focus on the first thing. In the 80s, it was crack. In the 90s, it was meth. Now people are starting to, as we move away slowly from opiates, they're starting to really double down and focus their efforts on weed. And the problem is, and maybe this is where I'll bring in keeping yourself open to new principles, new concepts, is the fact that the concept we keep looking at is that there's inherently a problem with the drugs, and B, that addicts are different than other people. And I don't think either of those is true. But the problem is that when you look at things from a singular perspective, and we did an episode on this in this podcast on, when you disagree with somebody, how to resolve the perspective differences. And so I hope we can get to do that here today. And what ends up happening a lot of times is the people who have that perspective, that the problem is just that addicts are addicts and they are inherently addicts and they will be addicts forever, and the drugs are the problem, then where they look to solve things is by fixing addicts and by stopping drugs from coming into the country or stopping people from holding drugs. So again, right, we talked about perspective when you disagree with people. From that perspective, drugs are evil and people who become addicted to drugs are different than other people. They are addicts. They belong in a different category. I 100% understand the current approach we have on drugs. Why? Because if you think that the drugs are the thing that is bad, then you got to stop people from having access to drugs. And the way to stop people from having access to drugs is to stop them from coming in through the borders and through other means. So that's one thing. That's interdiction, right? You catch the drugs. And the other one is you tell people, if I catch you with drugs, I will punish you so heavily that you will not want to have drugs anymore. And it'll scare other people from wanting to hold drugs. So that's how you get over the fact that drugs are bad. And if people who have addiction are inherently different than others, then the goal is to identify them, figure out how to identify them, and then separate them and treat them. The problem is, of course, that there are some other assumptions built into this, and like the fact that if addicts are different than other people and always have been and always will be, then they never get to leave that state. And if that is true and addicts are different than other people, then essentially kind of no matter what you do to them, inherently based on the brain structure, the milieu of how they got to become addicts, so why they are addicts, they are resistant to anything that keeps them away from moving towards drugs. And so these two things clash with one another. If you believe that addicts don't care about anything other than their drugs, and there's something inherent in their being that will make them that way forever, it doesn't matter what you do to drugs. It doesn't matter how big the punishment is. It doesn't matter how hard, all getting drugs at the border does, period, is it increases the price of drugs. That's all it does. Because the less drugs there are, the lower the supply. The lower the supply, if the demand stays the same, then the price goes up. But if addicts are addicts, then they shouldn't respond to supply and demand pricing because they don't care. They're addicted to the drug. So I think these two things are in competition with one another. If addicts really are these different class of people with brains that are so focused on the substance use they can't, or the addictive behavior they can't do anything, then they will keep chasing it for the rest of their life no matter what you do, even if part of what you do is do things that make the drugs harder to get, make it more punishable for you to have drugs, and make the drugs more expensive. Addicts supposedly don't care. Now, So that's one of the ways the system fails us, right? The criminalization of drugs supposes that drugs are bad, first of all. And then it's supposed that by making them a criminal, less people will want to use them. But I got news for you. People who aren't struggling with cocaine can use cocaine and not have a fucking problem with it. It's just true. There are people, earmuffs for those of you who can't take this, but it's also true. There are people who use cocaine totally recreationally. They don't have a problem with it. Why we make that criminal for them, I have no idea. Just like there are people who can drink alcohol and have no problem with it. And alcohol is legal, well, partially also because of advocacy by groups who make alcohol. But we just picked some drugs that we think are worse than others. But cocaine is not a problem for the vast majority of people who try cocaine. Cocaine is only a problem for a subset of people, a small subset, somewhere between 10 and 20% of people who try it. Not tiny, but a small subset. So what we do then is we say, oh, for those people, it's a problem. So now we've had two issues. Now, because it's a problem for a subset of people, we've made it illegal for everybody else, which means we will throw people in jail who are not cocaine addicts, but they had cocaine on them, first of all. Secondly, we now have separated out the cocaine addicts out of the equation. And now, as somebody pointed out here, we try to treat them. But we try to treat them from the approach that they are inherently different. So treating them is not exactly treating them to change the way they are. It's not treating them to get rid of the fact that they are addicts or addicted. It's treating them in the way that we, treat aggressive cancer or something like that. And that is like, we try to keep the symptoms at bay. We try to keep their substance use down. So from that vantage point, addicts are different than other people and drugs are bad, okay? From that vantage point, our current strategy makes 100% sense. And the reason I went through that little exercise with you is I want you to understand, I get it why the policies are what they are. What I'd like to get into conversation with about people who disagree with my methods is, I don't believe the current system is working, and I'd love it if somebody could show me why it is, why it's working really, really well for people, and we should just double down on it. Because if you can, then that's great. But I don't think I can share my screen on this. But if you go and look at overdose rates over the last 30 years, 20 some years that we have that I have really easy access to in terms of data, we've had a constantly increasing rate. And yes, it's gotten worse with fentanyl. But the rate of overdose has been increasing consistently for decades. The rate of addiction has remained pretty much consistent. The only thing that's gone up is the incarceration rate, and that is how many people end up in jails and in prisons because of drugs and overdoses. I'm not seeing how exactly anybody can measure those as successes. I mean, I would imagine that what success would look like is a reduction in all those things, right? And I don't know if everybody agrees with me on that, but that's a big part of my perspective. And so from the perspective that drugs are bad and addicts are different than others, I see why we do things the way that we do. And here's where I say, sometimes it's important to be open to concepts, ideas that are completely, inherently different than yours. Because when we're faced with a problem like this, a system, an addiction treatment system that costs, or that engaging in, costs billions of dollars annually, and by that I'm including detox, residential, outpatient treatment, I'm including sober living, I'm including medication-assisted treatment, a system that has billions of dollars coming into it, you would hope, I believe, that it would chip away at the problem that you're dealing with, right? That it would reduce the overall problem. And if we look at how many people struggle with addiction, or we look at the social costs of addiction, or we look at overdose deaths, or we look at accidental deaths, we look at a lot of indicators of addiction, we're not seeing an improvement. And so that is, to me, where the entry point has to be for potentially radical transformation in the way that we look at the problem. Because what I'd like to posit, what I'd like to suggest is that maybe we're not looking at it the right way. Maybe our perspective on addiction is not the right one. Maybe A, either drugs are not the problem, or B, addicts are not the kind of people we think they are. And we need a complete rethinking of the issue at hand. I mean, one of the people on here live right now is saying that, after a while sober, she had a relapse, a cheat day, as she called it. And then she got right back on the horse. And over a period of 2 years, she's able to celebrate that. But you understand that even when you're saying that, you are going against the standard of what is accepted. Because the current accepted standard is that once you slip up, once you experiment again, once you have a taste, you are no longer part of the sober group. You have exited that group. You're allowed to enter back into it if you want, but you must start back at zero. It's like a Monopoly game, Go back to the start. Do not collect 200. So, to me, this means we need to completely rethink our baseline beliefs about what's going on. And one of the baseline beliefs that I think we need to reconsider for sure is the criminalization of drugs. There aren't a lot of other areas in life where we tell people what they can put in their bodies. I mean, look, it's technically not illegal to drink cleaning products. There's just warnings by cleaning product manufacturers mandated by law to tell you this is not a smart thing to put in your body. But it's not against the law to put that in your body. It's actually not technically against the law to ingest drugs per se. So being under the influence of drugs by yourself at home is not actually technically illegal. It's the possession of those drugs or the sale of those drugs that is illegal, which means it's hard for you to get them if it's impossible to sell them and it's impossible to hold them. That means you have to have drug dealers in the middle to do the job. Now, I used to be a drug dealer. And so I'll tell you that business operates like any other business. You have wholesalers that sell to essentially retailers, and those retailers sell to customers. But the belief that drugs are bad and that is why we have a drug problem ignores many, many different realities. Not the least of which is the fact that drugs are technically equally available in many other places in the world that do not struggle with our level of drug use. And that actually, what we see in the world is that oftentimes the more draconian the drug enforcement, the more problematic the struggle with drugs is. We've been putting trillions of dollars into trying to stop drugs from coming into this country, and it just doesn't work. By some estimates, I don't remember where I saw this last, but it was, in the last decade, literally. We could get 80 to 90% of the cocaine that gets into this country, and there would still be enough cocaine for everybody who's trying to use it. And we can't ignore that, right? Like, by no measure are we getting anywhere near 80 to 90% of it. We're getting 20, 30, 40% maybe of the amount of cocaine and other drugs that are trying to come into this country. So that means that for all of our efforts, we suck at stopping drugs from coming into the country. Any good user knows how to get the drugs that they want, and it's not that big a deal for them. They understand the process. And so if drugs are not bad, and we need to move out of the place in the world where we decide that we tell people what to do with their own bodies and selves, then decriminalization could potentially give us that. And it would also do one other thing that would be pretty magnificent if you think about it, is it would rob underground, illegal, black market communities and systems of their money, of some of their money, right? Because the drug wouldn't be illegal anymore. Potentially, it could even add one other amazing element to this. Everybody is now paying attention to fentanyl around opiates. But the problem is that these are all black market drugs, so people slip in fentanyl to enhance the quality, the effect that people get from the pills and heroin, etc., that they're buying, cocaine. But if you decriminalize drugs and potentially legalize them so that they could be sold through more traditional routes, then government regulations all of a sudden apply, and then you just don't find yourself with any fentanyl in this stuff. And so, yes, it is all about the money, as you're saying, Heather, but it's about the money from many, many different directions. So if we as a community, and by community I mean all of us paying attention to this right now, all of us listening, all of us engaged, stop believing the bullshit that the drugs are inherently bad, then we can start addressing the real problem, which is, why are so many people looking for a way out? Why are so many people looking to escape? And that's where the system fails people. Where the system fails people is it makes it about the drugs and it makes it about the people, and it ignores the system. It ignores the environmental influences, it ignores the trauma, it ignores the psychology of coping and of trauma and of stress. Because if I can make people believe that they are the problem, then I don't have to change at all. If I can make people believe that those others, those addicts, are evil, weak-willed, pathetic, lazy, unmotivated people, then I can do whatever I want with them. I can lock them up involuntarily. I can arrest them. I can take away their rights, because they are not like us. They are not normal people. And this benefits not only, of course, systems like the prison complex, right? The private prison complex, right? So many prisons now in the country are operated and run by not the towns and the cities in which they exist, but rather by private organizations that are there to make money. And so the more rules there are, they put more people in jails and prisons, the better it is for those organizations. But by the way, it also kind of works for the treatment industry. Because if addicts never get better, then I have to treat them forever. But I'll tell you, look, not always. But I 100% have dealt with people who come in completely thinking that they are lifelong addicts. Everybody in their life completely imagining that they are lifelong, quote unquote, addicts, is where I put that in air quotes. And then they just beat their issue. They just beat it. They address the underlying problems. They change their environmental stressors. They overcome trauma and change their internal beliefs about who they are. And then they move on. And that's the second place where we have to really potentially introduce an entirely new way of thinking about what's going on. And that is, maybe addicts are not at all different than other people. Maybe addicts, again, in air quotes, are just normal people. Just normal people who found something that worked really, really well for them. Almost, we could just say like a medicine that worked really, really well for them. And it's just, they used it for so long that they've gotten their bodies, their brains have gotten so used to using it that they've let go of creating and relying on any other coping strategies, anything else in their life that could help them. And so now they're just stuck in a habitual, compulsive use pattern. Not because they're different humans, not because there's anything that makes addicts different, but because that's how we do things. We do things habitually, and they are doing things habitually. And that's it. They're not at all different. They're doing the same thing the rest of us have done in other areas of our lives, but our habits haven't crossed over into something that is a diagnosable disorder that gets recognized by the American Psychiatric Association or anything like that. And if we can do that, if we can drive that understanding into our heads as a system, if we can stay open to reconceptualizing how we look at the problem, then all of a sudden new solutions present themselves. I hope that was useful. I hope that allowed you to maybe look at this from a different angle. Look at it not from a deficit-based, what is wrong with these people and what is wrong with drugs, but rather an exploratory curiosity place. We can examine the real factors that play a role in people becoming addicted to drugs and behaviors. Because if we can do that, if we can open ourselves up to other ways of looking at the problem, all new possibilities open up. I was talking to somebody, I don't know how many people remember that game Minesweeper. I'll end with this, but remember that game Minesweeper? PCs would have it. I think Macs would have it too, but like in their built-in games, you would have to click on there would be like a square with all these little tiles, and you have to click on a tile, hope there's not a bomb under it. And if there isn't a bomb under it, then most tiles would open up a little range of tiles. It was like there was a map of the world, but you couldn't see the rest of the map until you went one step farther. And when you did that, though, a new part of the map would open up. And I think that's what happens here with perspective. If we can start looking at this problem differently, all of a sudden new options for treatment, new options for helping people who struggle would magically open up because we're looking at the issue from a different vantage point. And the reason I want to do this is I don't want something like 500,000 people dying from addiction anymore. It's ridiculous. It's insane. It's got to end. And the system we have in place right now is just not doing it. So hopefully this gave you some insight into other ways of approaching the problem. I hope it was useful. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you next week. Thank you for tuning in to the Ignited Heroes Recovery Podcast. I really hope you found the information here useful and that we'll see you back here next week. And look, I want to make sure that this podcast is the most useful it can be for you, so please let me know by emailing info@ignited.com if there are any specific topics or questions you'd like to have addressed. As usual, if you like this episode, I would love for you to leave us a 5-star review and rating. Thanks, and see you next week.